Cool. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the half-hour podcast. I'm your one co-host, Adrian Graham, with my other co-host,
YuYu. Hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about the State of the Union with President Biden. Well, not as a special guest. He's just a person. He's the one who gave the State of the Union. And that's that.
Okay, we're going to work on that. Hello, everybody. Talking about the State of the Union address. I know, kind of boring, kind of mid, but it's okay. We're going to get through this together because, believe it or not, it is very important for domestic politics and domestic extemp. So we do have to address this. I would like to apologize that last week you had also heard me give the intro twice in a row. And that's just because I miscounted, because I'm kind of dumb. So we're going to have Adrian, or we had Adrian do this intro, and then I will come back. I'm just kidding. I will not come back and do this intro. Spencer will do this intro while I sit on the sidelines next week. So stay tuned. Besides that, though, it's the State of the Union address. People love it. People hate it. People don't care and don't pay attention. I am in between caring and not paying attention. I watch tidbits and snippets of the State of the Union address because I do not have the attention span to watch the hour-long version. I don't know about you, Adrian, but that's me.
I'm definitely the don't care type. And in fact, the only reason I did pay attention to it was for answering these questions. But let's go for Extemp. For teaching us more about the world and forcing us to do research and forcing us to be aware of current events and current politics.
Well, I can't put it any better. So without further ado, Adrian, start us off.
Cool. Well, let's just start from the beginning. I think it's important to just address what the State of the Union is, because as we just pointed out, nobody really cares that much about it, which means you probably don't know a lot about it simultaneously. And as we just talked about, I didn't watch it. You watched it, snips and tidbits, probably because she wanted to also have some good background for this episode. No other reason or purpose. So let's just talk about it. It's important to talk about the roots of where the State of the Union actually started, which was back in, believe it or not, under George Washington, who decided that maybe it's time for not only Congress, but also people to just sort of hear what I have to say, because believe it or not, back then they didn't have cool cell phones, they didn't have their cool laptops, and they didn't have Extemp Genie pull up all their articles for them about what's going on in the world. And in fact, they just had to rely on what casual news George Washington was able to give at that time. So he does hold the record for the world's shortest State of the Union address, which is also kind of funny. And which he was just sort of hey, this is what Congress is working on. I think y'all are cool people. Peace out. Good night. And that was it. Like I said, times have changed. And right now, the State of the Union doesn't really serve that exact same purpose. It's not just about letting people know what's going on in Congress, because we always know what's going on in Congress. For example, we know that Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be yelling at Pelosi the whole time. And that's just, wait, no, those are two different parts of the Senate. Anyways, they still hate each other. They're still going to yell at each other. We know these fundamental truth and fundamental facts. But nowadays, it sort of acts as a lightning rod for attention on certain issues that the president wants to speak out on. And because of his name and the fact that Biden himself is speaking, which is different from a lot of his other press conferences, which he gives a lot more frequently, people actually care about this event and they actually tune in, or at least they should, a little bit more than anything else. He gives one of these once every year. People pay attention, they tune in, they listen to what the administration is doing and what they plan on doing going forward in the future. With that out of the way, I think it's important to talk about just sort of some big concepts that he talks about, and also just sort of a roadmap of what does that mean? I guess it's not really it. Anyways, first off, he talked about COVID, which is obviously. And he made it pretty clear that he thinks that we're returning to at least some state of normalcy, that we've truly entered at least a sort of post-COVID world. And he still called upon people to make sure they're getting their vaccinations and that, that they were still in the picture. But also he had a strangely nationalistic undertone when he said it's necessary for us to, quote, fill our downtowns and keep the schools open. He also said that they don't know if or when another variant will rear its ugly head and force people to be ready for it, which sort of conflicts his first point in his like introduction when he was like, I think that we should be very optimistic about the way that the coronavirus pandemic is heading. So at the very least, they're, I guess, cautiously optimistic or just like hoping for the best. But it seems right now that the Biden administration is sort of toning down their care and want to put attention towards other things that aren't just the COVID pandemic. But also, interestingly, the State of the Union also had very light protocols relating to COVID at the actual like place where it was held, which is the White House, saying that masks and social distancing were at the discretion of the people who were fully vaccinated. And interestingly, Biden himself did not wear one when he was speaking, which I believe is different from last year where he did wear one. The chamber also increased to hold all 1,500 people as opposed to just the 200 people and the 200 people that were allowed in last year's chamber. So it shows that like not only the administration on like the national level is looking to sort of like ease up COVID restrictions, sort of like return to normal, but also even within the White House themselves and just like, you know, Biden himself is sort of like saying, okay, I think we're getting in a better spot and we can probably take a few less precautions, which, you know, lines up with like what the CDC has been saying. And hopefully, yeah, we'll see if and when he continues on this track that he's been trying to do. And lastly with this, he also said that the day we're recording this, Wednesday, March 9th, question mark? Yeah. He would be announcing his actual plan for COVID in the future months and for the future of the administration. So be on the lookout for that. Things could change. Next is that he also talked about the economy. And I think this is very interesting because he keeps going on this nationalistic bandwagon, which I think is just sort of like the theme of this entire speech. And that he's trying to sort of play down to like the middle now. He's no longer playing to like trying to get the left to support him. He's not trying to like necessarily get the right to like him, but he's sort of just going for like the centrist vote, or at the very least, like hoping for the right to be like passively okay with him, which I think is very hilarious and very funny. He tried to explain that he knew the solution to solving for the inflation crisis by making things domestically and to stop relying on others, i.e. our enemies, aka China. This is an interesting parallel to Trump, as Biden made it clear during his campaign and the day he first got into office that he would be good to America, but also prioritize the damage done to the international community by Trump. But he sort of seems to be backpedaling on this and saying that we need to actually make more things like semiconductors, like computer chips in the US, increase domestic wages, sort of thwart price gouging by large companies, and sort of lowering the dependence on imports from China. So it looks like the America First model may actually be making its way into the new administration, which is a huge change from before. And I can't say that I didn't expect it, but it is a very noticeable difference in the way that the administration acted before when it said it was done with trade wars with China and against our ally. The last thing I sort of want to touch up on here is Russia, which, you know, like it was bound to be brought up. Not sending troops into Ukraine is a bold move, and I feel like it's sort of like also brought up here in the State of the Union too, where he says that but like he's trying to lay down pressure on Russia as far as possible without needing to escalate, without needing to go to direct conflict with them, and he's doing so in a myriad of ways. Not only is he like put these massive sanctions on Russia, but he's also announced that U.S. airspace would be closed to Russia in accordance with other countries like Canada and like Britain, cutting off even more of Russia's economic ties and just sort of hurting their citizens too. He also welcomed the Ukrainian ambassador, Oksana Marakova, to the United States to discuss further plans. And I feel like this sort of shows that the administration is still caring about the issues going on in Ukraine, but also that it's important to, you know, like focus on these issues that are going on, especially with the administration going forward. Like we don't know how the situation is going to develop in the next couple months. And it's important that the administration make sure that everyone knows that they're on top of it. So I feel like using the State of the Union address to sort of like talk about that, this was probably like a good place to do it. I think that overall, like the biggest takeaway from all of that is just sort of like this like return to nationalism, the return of America first, the return to sort of just like, yeah, I'm sort of down for like leftist policies, but maybe like economically, I'm kind of shelling out to Trump over here, which is like a very interesting, I don't know if it's a turn for the Biden administration. I certainly feel like it sort of is. But it's definitely like a change of pace for what we've been seeing, where he's just been trying to like survive the pandemic. Now it sort of seems like, okay, we've survived. It's time to go forward, and it's time for us to push on and put America first. And with that, I guess it's off to you, YuYu.
Yeah, so that was like basically a great summary of what went on in the State of the Union address, main things that Biden had touched on. What I'm going to do is spill the tea, like always, but not necessarily spill the tea, because this time it's a little bit dry. We don't have that much tea to spill. Teacup's not full, but full disclosure again, I didn't watch the whole hour of the State of the Union address. I did watch some tidbits and read about what had happened during the State of the Union address in terms of like how the audience was receiving his speeches, where there were standing ovations and where there were booing. We'll talk about that later. But I think just as important as the content of the speech, we should also talk about how his speech was received among the public. And this is including the audience that was there, and also including how it was received among the American public. I think that there were a lot of things that Biden needed to address with the State of the Union speech. There's this ongoing pandemic that is going on that his administration needs to address. Not only that, but the economy also seems to be a major, major issue in the minds of many Americans in terms of inflation, prices going up, and just like general daily living things. But also with the fact that the Ukrainian and Russia crisis is still going on, still seeming to escalate, and there has been no progress towards an end yet. All those things needed to be addressed in the State of the Union address. Whether or not Biden actually got there and did everything that he needed to do still remains to be seen. As I think both of us kind of mention or like imply, the State of the Union address is mainly like for show, not necessarily for like, this is the plan of action that we're going to take. Lately, it's been more for show, as in what we're going to do moving forward so that I seem well received among the public, especially as like midterms are rolling around. So good to know. After the State of the Union address, Biden's popularity did improve in terms of percentage points. And just for consistency reasons, these statistics are from NPR and PBS, who conducted this poll together. So overall, Biden's approval rating increased 8 percentage points to 47%. There were also improvements in the public's view on how Biden was dealing with international and national problems. So, for example, his handling of Ukraine, approval ratings has increased 18 percentage points and is now at 52%. With COVID, his approval ratings increased 8 percentage points and is now at 55%. And in terms of the economy, his approval ratings have also increased by 8 percentage points to 45% now. The increase in approval percentage points is not equal among parties and not equal among the American citizens who identify with a certain party. And what I mean by this is that he has gained more approval with Democrats, but not necessarily with independents or Republicans, or at least in those groups, not as much as he gained approval within Democrats. So while approval ratings from all groups have increased, his approval really shot up among Democrats. And that's like significant because that is the party that he is representing and what he's trying to gain approval from. But then again, you do have this narrative where he is being a little bit more centrist, and we'll talk about that right now. So Biden is mainly using the Ukraine-Russia crisis as a way of mobilizing support, and it's been very useful. Like, it's been very effective. Many people actually agree with how Biden is dealing with the issue, despite sanctions on Russia causing gas price hikes, and seemingly these sanctions also hurting the way that inflation has been like seen or received among the public in terms of connecting inflation and price hikes to Biden's actions and things like that. So while people don't like inflation, people do like the fact that he has put economic sanctions on Russia. So I do have to mention here that while this is the case statistically, that he has gained more support in terms of like international handling of situations, I also do want to point out that statistics do not give you the full picture of what's going on and what people really think about how Biden is handling everything. But speech-wise, it seemed that this part of his speech on Ukraine garnered a lot of positive responses, especially when Ukrainian Ambassador Oksana Markarova was there as a guest of the First Lady. When she stood up and when she was mentioned, there was a standing ovation for her. So this was very well received. And the stuff that Biden had talked about in terms of how Ukrainian citizens are super strong in terms of combating Russian aggression and Russian troops also was received very well among the group that was there. Reception of domestic policy is where it gets interesting in terms of how people perceive Biden's actions, meaning the room was very divided. So when Biden started mentioning how the US is dealing with COVID in the past years and how tax cuts seem to benefit the rich more than anyone else, is where the Republican side in the room, who were there in the White House, started booing. I mean, I think this is the reception that is assumed that would happen in terms of when Biden started talking about everything that had happened in terms of like when President Trump was in office and how he dealt with COVID. And then now talking about how Biden himself is dealing with COVID, I think the reception among the Republican Party is not going to be a positive one. However, while he was discussing his goals for the future and what he was going to do for the US, many of the responses from news sources seemed to suggest that this was just for show and argued that while he brought up ideas like Medicare negotiating drug prices, decreasing the cost of childcare, and fixing US infrastructure, or doing things like doing more domestic manufacturing of parts so we're less reliant on other economies, less reliant on other countries for products and things like that. It seemed like he was only bringing up anything that he could salvage from the Build Back Better bill, or he could just salvage in general, but he was not really giving a well planned out kind of step-by-step basis or like well planned out agenda for how he was going to achieve those things. So what people did not hear in his speech was how these goals were going to come into fruition. And one of these examples is when Biden was talking about reproductive rights, but he did not ever call the bills that are still in place. He didn't call these bills abortion bills, nor has he said the word abortion as president, which I think is a pretty interesting claim. You could fact check this, but this was from the Guardian article that's linked down below, or wherever it is linked if you're listening on YouTube or on the podcast or anything like that. But this was just one of these examples because when we were talking, or Biden was talking about reproductive rights and how the Supreme Court was going to deal with anything, he didn't actually mention what the Supreme Court was doing and only just said that like reproductive rights are important and we should protect these for women. And in that case, this is where some people really were like, I don't think you're really doing anything. This doesn't seem like you are addressing the actual reality of what's going to happen is in probably like a couple of weeks or a couple of months that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, which is something significant in terms of like how the public has received his speech and his actual actions as president. So there's not much to it besides that there were mixed feelings about his speech, but overall his approval ratings have increased. Whether that was due to the State of the Union address or to other factors still remains to be seen. So yeah, I don't know about what you think about all this, Adrian, but I know for me, it seems mostly for show, like I've already mentioned.
Yeah, it definitely just feels like he's trying to like play up as much as he can. It definitely feels like he's trying to, like you said, salvage as much from like Build Back Better that he possibly can, because with midterms rolling around, I feel like the doomsday clock is ticking for him and his administration, and being able to like forefront these ideas of things that like he knows that he can hopefully get done, things like increasing like semiconductor production. He's just trying to like bank it all in on things that he's like, okay, if we can't get the climate done, please make sure we can get this done.
Right. And I guess like with that being said, I do want to mention that there are other news sources that believe his speech was actually very effective in terms of getting across his agenda and what he could provide for America. Like the Atlantic article that you can read is also linked somewhere around here where you're listening. It mainly talked about how Biden's speech was exactly what the American public needed right now in this moment, which was something that was just like clear cut and clean in terms of what is happening, what he's going to do about it, and what America needs to do about it. And I think that was what is positively received, or what was positively received by the public and the people listening to his speech. Mainly that he was just like upfront as he could be. let's just say. Well, that jumps us into today's questions, whenever you're listening to this. Is the first question is, should presidents continue to give the State of the Union in person? Bad question, just because it's kind of like a dry question, like a very boring question, but I'll let Adrian give his thoughts first.
Yeah. Don't pick this one. If you have any choice or any say in the matter, pick anything other than this, because it seems like you're not going to be able to make a whole lot of points off of this, especially not ones that are like related to like contemporary issues. I think that like the obvious answer is like maybe, and if you're going to take like the hardline stance, like no, you're probably like no, at least for the short term. Like COVID still exists, people are still getting sick. Like we've been able to like make compromises to the point where like people are feeling more comfortable and like going in, but like even in person, like the State of the Union still had like 2,000 people in that room, and like they were only required to wear masks or like social distance if they weren't vaccinated, and even those with vaccinations are still like, you know, low-key at risk. So if you're going to take the hardline stance, like no, just be like no, but probably like at least for the short term until we like sort of figure out what we can do here, until like Corona like calms down, whatever. Maybe there's some like weird jank fun point that you can make about that, like nobody cares about the State of the Union, so they don't really care that it's in person. If you did it online, maybe it'd reach like a broader audience. And if it's sort of like broadcasted online, then like more people like receive it, because nobody's just watching the State of the Union on their broadcast TV just for funsies. They're watching it on platforms that they might want to watch it on. But outside of that, I don't really know what you say to this question. Do you have any other thoughts?
I don't really have like any other thoughts besides that. The one thing that I would mention is maybe like if you don't have it in person, then you wouldn't get reactions such as booing in the middle of your speech. That was like, that's a thing, but I feel like that has been a thing regardless of if it was online or not. Just because like with the State of the Union address, I don't think moving it online would change the perception that people have with the speech or the purpose of what you're trying to get across to the audience. I think like with the State of the Union address, it is in person, it is in the White House, there's like senators, representatives invited, things like that. But like what it is just mainly for show, and technically it is like broadcasted online. So it doesn't necessarily like mean anything if you just fully move it online, besides getting rid of the crowd that is there. I don't necessarily know how that affects everything per se as like speech and debate kids, but I do know that like if you were to think about it this way, like a year or like 2 years now of speech and debate online has not been the greatest thing in the world, right? Because there is less that can be, you know, persuaded across when you are online, since on this kind of platform, it is harder to distinguish your like tones, purposes, things like that, facial expressions even. And so that might be a factor in considering this question too. But I agree with Adrian that I don't really know of any solid points that you could bring up in terms of this question in particular. I really don't know why I wrote this question. It's not my favorite out of all of them that I've seen. So yeah, if you do end up getting this question, just like don't pick this one. I'm sure there are better ones. I'm sure we've done episodes on them. Pick those instead. Okay, but we can move on to the second question. Is it too late for President Biden to salvage his domestic agenda? Which I think is where the meat of this episode is really going to be. And I'll let Adrian start off again too.
Cool. I think that when you're talking about Biden's domestic agenda, I think it's important to sort of like outline what his domestic agenda is. Like, sure, he's talking like big things about like the semiconductors, and he's talking big things about like COVID policy, but like, is that like what his agenda is? I don't know. Maybe it's certainly part of it. But I think when you're talking about like Biden's political agenda, you know that he has to be talking about things like climate change and about like race, because those were like the things that like he ran on. Those are the things that like people have been pressuring him to do from the left. Those are the things that like he went into office and said, I got big plans for these two specific things. And by the end of my 4 years, if you don't see a change, you can throw me in the garbage. And it's sort of looking like he's going in the garbage, not going to lie. So when you're asked to evaluate, like, is it too late for him to salvage the agenda? I think that in some ways, yes, that like we've seen through like Build Back Better, we saw through the infrastructure bill that just like climate change is not happening. And on like a much like sadder note, like race related like legislation has also been like super duper downplayed. Like we just had another issue with like no knock warrants recently, where another person was killed at the hands of the police, another Black individual, and like not a word from the administration. It's just sort of surprising to me that like that hasn't happened. And when you're talking about like, is he going to be able to like recover that agenda and actually be able to like solve for those things? I think the answer is like probably not. And like you have like a ton of roadblocks to like the reasoning behind that. Like you have senators like Joe Manchin who are just going to be like, absolutely no climate change. Climate change isn't real. Die about it. You have the problem with like midterms coming up that like, even if you think that like he's got a chance to do them, that he has to do them in like the next couple months, because by the time midterms roll around, all of his like political backing in the Senate is gone and all legislation has to be like mega bipartisan or bust, because nobody's going to want to be able to like vote for things like climate change if it's on the bill. And that's what Biden's been pushing for just so long. I think that in terms of like his other political agenda things, I feel like his COVID agenda, like I said, there will be updates, like I guess in your relative past, that sort of like outlines what his plan is. But like, I don't really know like what more the administration plans on like doing with COVID. Just sort of like, we've gone through like all the like the rules and regulations, and it's been like that for just like so long. Now they're starting to like ease up on it. I feel like that's like going to hurt his like political standing. He doesn't have anything to salvage on that. In terms of like, maybe there's a chance for him to salvage like some parts of it, like you was talking about. Like I feel like semiconductor is the semiconductor production facilities in the United States, and like being able to like stop businesses like colluding to raise prices. Maybe he does something about that, but like, what are the chances that he does? Just because he's so focused on like his own agenda, like climate and hopefully race, that I don't think he's going to have time to like get around to those things before we see the midterm switch. So I feel like if you're going to answer this question, the answer is probably no, but you could make a very good case for as to why you think like certain parts of his agenda and certain parts of legislation are going to be able to be pushed through.
Yeah. And on that note, like that would mean that his domestic agenda is salvageable if you are able to, you know, push through some specifics of the original agenda, then that is salvaging the agenda. It's not like pushing the whole agenda or the original agenda through, but it is enough to say that it is salvageable. I will say that, you know, in terms of what he used to get into office versus what his agenda is now is very different. And that's just because like when he's trying to pass these bills, what we've seen with the infrastructure bill and the developments with that and the Build Back Better bill, we've seen that there had to be major concessions for it to pass through. And I will say that like the $1 trillion infrastructure bill did end up getting passed, but there were major concessions to it, as in there's not going to be education infrastructure included, is what I've seen, and things with climate change. Specifics about that are also not included in the infrastructure bill. I think it mentions that in one of the articles that we link below. I haven't caught up on that yet. But in terms of what we've seen so far and how he's passing these things and what agenda he's trying to pursue, there's always pushback and there's always some type of concession that has happened to a certain degree. And this is what makes his domestic agenda seem very unsalvageable. Like, if he cannot get across the main goal, what he wanted to get across in the first place, then it's not going to be received well in the public. So, for example, when we talked about in his speech, he mentioned things that were happening and that were things that he mentioned at the beginning of his campaign, for example, reproductive rights. But now the American public knows that in a couple months or a couple of weeks or so, Roe v. Wade is probably going to be overturned by the Supreme Court justice. Or there was also the promise of, getting rid of student loans and getting rid of student loan debt, but that didn't end up happening either. And so it seems that the domestic agenda that he started out with is not going to be coming into fruition as well as his administration thought it would. And that is kind of the biggest reasons why I think answering yes to this question is possible, just because of all of the failures and all the concessions that we've seen when he's tried to propose something or enact something. I would say that in order to answer no to this and say it's not too late to salvage the domestic agenda, you would have to mention things about how, his approval ratings have increased. It seems that there are some issues that Congress or even the Senate is willing to be very bipartisan about. The Supreme Court hasn't entirely gone back against, or at least the Supreme Court still continues to surprise us in terms of what they've decided to pass and what they've decided, or not pass per se, but what they've decided to say is constitutional and what they've decided is not constitutional. In that, while there is this idea of overturning Roe v. Wade, there is also things that are very good in terms of I think the pipe that was going to be built on Native American land that was not accepted or constitutional in the Supreme Court. And that was something that was very surprising and shocking, but in a good way, so those ideas, those little bits and pieces, and those little concessions for Democrats here and there are what makes the domestic agenda seem salvageable. But I would say there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest that the domestic agenda is no longer salvageable. So do with that what you will.
I'm excited to see what will get passed by the Biden admin before midterms. I hope that we're wrong and that we get to see some cool things. But it might be over for him.
I mean, it's midterms. We won't actually know if he's out of office or if he stays in office for another 4 years until 2 years have passed. So I guess we'll get back to you in 2024 if we're still doing this. What will we be? Juniors at that point in college?
I'll be old, trademark.
Yeah, we'll be old. Maybe trademark. Maybe we'll actually make money off of this by then. But we will see. I think that this wraps up the whole episode if you don't have anything else to say, Adrian.
Before we go, I just had a cool fun fact. Did you know that Ukraine has received over $50 million in donations from cryptocurrency since the start of the war efforts? And it's the only way, or one of the only ways they can get finance, because they had to freeze most of their financial institutions and freeze most of the bank accounts.
Did you know that people were renting a lot of Airbnbs in Ukraine and not actually going to go to Ukraine in order to get money to some of its citizens?
Yeah.
The more you know. Yeah, so I wish Extemp questions covered those little fun facts, but sometimes they don't end up doing that, which is fine. This is important or whatever, I guess. But yeah, so I'm glad that we could talk about the State of the Union address, what it means for the national public, what it means for midterms and the domestic agenda. So I hope you get the one. If you don't, tell us how you did. Tell us how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either me or Spencer or email Adrian, because he still does not have an Instagram. If you are not subscribed to our YouTube channel, go to YouTube, look it up, okay, the half hour, all right, find our episodes, and then click the red subscribe button so that you are subscribed to our channel. And also don't forget to click the bell next to the subscribe button or somewhere around the video, I don't know, so that you don't miss notifications that we have posted a video, because our videos are posted a day or two earlier than it is posted on OneClap. So do that. Support OneClap, but also support us because we're broke college students. So yeah, make sure to follow us on social media at the Half Hour Extemp Podcast on our Twitter and our Instagram. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening to this 30-ish minute video about the State of the Union address. And thank you, Adrian, for these wonderful past 3 weeks of filling in for Spencer.
It's been a pleasure. I'm sad I won't ever be coming back. This is my final hurrah.
Well, that's not true. That's not true. Stay tuned, audience. Stay tuned.